Hi folks, Bitey Jingles here again. Welcome back to my continuing patch 7.5 preview goodness. Today I want to talk about the reduced matchmaking spread in patch 7.5. For those of you who haven't been paying attention to the official forums or the news, in patch 7.5 the matchmaking spread of just about every vehicle in the game is being reduced by 1. And when I'm talking about the matchmaking spread, what that means is the difference between the vehicles, the tier of the vehicle that you are queuing for a game with, and the maximum tier of the vehicles that you can be queued against. At the moment on the live servers, that's more or less a 3-tier spread for the majority of vehicles. In patch 7.5, that's been reduced to a 2-tier spread, just about across the board. There are exceptions. Artillery always had higher matchmaking spreads. That hasn't changed. Light tanks had pretty rough matchmaking spread. In the majority of cases, that's actually being reduced, but they still have a bigger or wider matchmaker spread than other vehicles because they're light tanks and their role is scouting. However, in the overwhelming majority of cases, if you queue up in a tier 5 vehicle, the biggest thing you're going to face will be a tier 7 vehicle. If you queue up in a tier 6 vehicle, the biggest thing you are ever going to face will be a tier 8 vehicle. If you queue in a tier 7 vehicle, the biggest thing you're going to face will be a tier 9 vehicle, and so on and so on and so on. There are exceptions. There are a list of special vehicles which have special matchmaking, particular only to that vehicle. The Churchill was always the famous one. The Churchill only ever got its tier 5 premium heavy tank. It only ever got into tier 5 and 6 games. That hasn't changed. The Matilda, the tier 5 premium medium tank, and the T25 now have exactly the same matchmaking as the Churchill. So your tier 5 premiums only ever get into tier 5 and 6 games, which is great news if you're driving a tier 5 premium. But in the majority of cases, 2 tiers is the only is the maximum that you're ever going to face against, and you're not all, because that's the maximum. You're not always going to face that. You might, in the majority of cases, your average game, you queue up in a tier 5 vehicle, you're going to get into a tier 6 battle. Sometimes you get into a tier 5 battle, sometimes you get into a tier 7 battle, but most of the time you're going to get into a tier 6 battle, and nobody can complain that there's nothing they can do if that's the environment that you're playing in. So this is it's a huge change. Can't really predict how it's going to affect the game, but it's going to make things a lot easier for the average player. The average, and I don't want to sound dismissive here, but the majority of people, and I'm sure anybody watching this video who plays Worlds of Tanks will agree with me, the majority of your teammates are not very good. And if you take somebody who's not very good and you put him in a medium tier 5 tank and throw him into a game with Tiger 2s on the other side of the battlefield, he's not going to do very well. So this is, I think it's a long overdue. People have been complaining about this and asking for this for a long time. And I think Wargaming have finally realised that the benefits from a business perspective outweigh the drawbacks, because the average player who doesn't take the game as seriously as I do, not to say that I take the game very, very seriously, but I try to play the best that I can. I know the strengths of all the tanks that I'm driving. I know the weaknesses of the tanks that I'm driving against, and I know how to try to take advantage of that. Most players don't. They just play the tanks that they have fun in. They don't know why they have fun in those tanks. That's a fun tank. They play that tank, and that's fine. It's a free-to-play game. Play it any way you like. And this change is going to be good for the majority of players who are like that. That's not a bad thing. And it's going to be good for the players who are, I'm not going to say good players, but the players who are competent, who understand the mechanics and try to do their best. Because it's going to be a lot easier to be good. However, be careful what you wish for. With that reduced matchmaking spread, a lot of the vehicles in the game that are currently in the game, not the new ones that are coming in 7.5, they're being rebalanced so that they're not overpowered within that narrower spread of vehicles that they can be faced against. And one such vehicle is the Su-85. What's changed about the Su-85? Well, it's lost its 107mm gun. If any of you have watched my Su-85 video, I didn't actually talk a lot in it. I was mostly just crying with laughter, as that 107mm gun brought the pain to everything I pointed it at. Su-85 in a tier 5 or 6 game with that gun absolutely dominates. But now that it's no longer going to face tier 8 heavy tanks, does it really need that 107mm gun? Well, if we're going to be honest here, no, it doesn't. So that gun's been removed, and this is now your gun selection on the Su-85, and that is the top gun, the 85mm D5S 85BM. It's a bit of a mouthful, and you know what? It works just fine. It's not a bad gun. It was the gun that you went through on the way to the 107, and it's not bad. You know, it works with the reduced matchmaking spread that this thing gets into. Tier 7 heavies are the worst thing that you're going to come up against, and this gun can handle tier 7 heavies no problem. And this is kind of what they've done across the board. There are various nerfs and tweaks all around. For example, the T28 has lost its I want to say T28, I don't mean the tank destroyer, I mean the tier 4 medium Russian tank. It's lost its 85mm gun, which is going to be fantastic news for Churchill drivers. But it still has the 57mm ZIS-4 gun that the T34 tier 5 medium tank gets, and that's a perfectly fine gun on the T28, as this is a perfectly fine gun on the Su-85, given the fact that the matchmaking spread has been reduced across the board. And to prove it, we'll have a game. Okay, here we are, and this is the average matchmaker spread that you can expect to see once 7.5 goes live. We're in a tier 5 vehicle. We have
Let's get this show on the road.
A tier 4 medium, and we have a tier 6 heavy tank, and that's pretty much the average sort of game you're going to get into once 7.5 goes live. If you ever look down on the bottom of the list there, we've got a T28 tier 4 medium tank. This is the worst matchmaking spread that guy is ever going to see. He is never going to see tier 7 heavy tanks again. Unless, of course, you platoon up with somebody who has a higher matchmaking spread than you do. But, you know, if that's the case, you get what you deserve. And this is pretty much it. And in this sort of game, this 85mm gun, I mean, you've got to be sad to see that 107mm go. It was an amazingly good gun. Oh, here comes an M7 medium tank. Gotcha.
He's gone. Find another target.
But, yeah, I mean, nobody's going to be happy to see the 107mm gun go from the Su-85, except for people who are getting shot at by the 107mm gun on the Su-85. But I am forced to admit that with this reduced matchmaking spread, the Su-85 does not need... Oh, ARL-44 on the hill, we can have him. Yeah, the Su-85 does not need that 107mm gun. It would be completely overpowered with that gun. And so you end up... I mean, previously I kind of played the Su-85 like a... When you get the ISU-152 with the BL-10 gun on it, it's a monster of a tank. It just lurks around at choke points and obliterates anything that tries to push through. And that's how I kind of played. I played the Su-85 like a mini ISU-152 with the BL-10 gun, the troll cannon. You can't really do that anymore. You don't have that monstrous alpha damage. You still have pretty good top-end damage, although the French Tier 5 tank destroyer now has the most alpha damage at Tier 5. I can't remember what it's called. I'm sure somebody will let me know in the comments. But that now has the biggest alpha damage out of all the Tier 5 tank destroyers, with the Su-85 coming second. But the Su-85 has a better rate of fire, 10 rounds per minute. It's not quite there up at Stug 3 standards, but it's still a quick firing gun. So this thing is still entirely playable. You just have to play it differently. It's not a little mini ISU 152 anymore, it's more like the Stug. And the Stug's a good machine. There we go. T-34, we could deal with him. Bang. Straight in the side of the turret.
They're hit.
There we go. Enemy tier 6 TD.
Looks like that one went right through.
No problem.
Got him.
So you just pretty much have to take advantage of the Stug's other characteristics than the monster gun that it used to have. No, sorry, not the Stug, the SU-85. You know, it used to have a monster gun, and that was pretty much, you just followed that gun around. And the SU-85 had other things going for it. I mean, as you can see, it's really quick. It's very stealthy. Just trying to root out that ARL-44 I hit earlier. And, yeah, I mean, it's quick, it's stealthy. It's still got a good gun. It just doesn't have an overpowered gun anymore. Definitely needed that 107mm gun to compete in Tier 8 games, but since you're never going to get into Tier 8 games anymore, you really didn't need that 107mm gun. And with this reduced matchmaking spread, with that gun, a majority of your battles being Tier 7 games, Tier 6 games, sorry, that gun would have been overpowered. So I'm forced to admit that it probably was necessary to remove it. But you can still do really, really well with the 85mm gun in the SU-85. And that's true, I think, of most of the changes that are occurring in 7.5, rebalancing the tanks to fit, to be more competitive and less overpowered in certain cases with the reduced tier patch 7.5 matchmaker. So the SU-85 loses its 107mm gun, the T-28 loses its 85mm gun, and you know, and so on and so on. But it's still fun to play. You just have to play it. I mean, you may have ended up playing it more like the Stug anyway. Those of you who played it like a mini ISU 152 are just going to have to adapt. It's still entirely capable of looking after itself. It's still a great Tier 5 tank destroyer, and the games it's going to get into, in common with all of the other tanks in 7.5, are going to be a lot more balanced. Easier games for you to do well in if you're any good, and your team shouldn't let you down as badly, because it's going to be easier for a mediocre player to perform reasonably well, because the tanks that they're facing aren't going to be quite so overpowered within the tier spread. So that's the news of the matchmaking changes in 7.5. Stay tuned for more 7.5 preview goodness.